Hi, welcome to episode 32 of The Comic Source. I'm your host Jace. Just a couple quick items of news. DC has announced that Batman Eternal 52, the final issue of that series, is going to be 48 pages rather than the previously solicited 20, and the price is going to be $3.99 rather than $2.99. On the Marvel side of things, the Avengers Age of Ultron trailer was released today.
Isn't why we fight so we can end the fight and go home?
Well, you amazingly failed.
So stand and fight.
I'm always picking up after you boys.
That's the best you can do! You had to ask.
And from what we can see in the trailer, it certainly looks like Marvel's going to have another big blockbuster hit on their hands. Before you head out to the theaters to see that movie, AMC is actually going to be running a Marvel Marathon. Starting Wednesday, April 29th at 6 p.m., they're going to be playing all 10 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies back to back. It's going to take about 25 hours and it'll finish up the next night, Thursday, at about 7. So before you go out to your midnight showing of Avengers Age of Ultron, you can get caught up on all the previous Marvel Cinematic Universe movies. Now on to the books I'm going to talk about for today. First book I want to mention is Swamp Thing, number 40. This is the series finale written by Charles Soule. The pencils were handled by Jesus Saez and Javi Pina worked on the inks together, and the colors were by June Chung. So this was a very meta issue. Swamp Thing didn't necessarily break the fourth wall, but he certainly did a lot of talking and exposition about story and how every story must have an ending. So Charles Soule is an excellent writer. I feel like his run on Swamp Thing didn't get the attention that it deserved, and I hope to see him return to the character someday. Although this is the series finale for Swamp Thing, as I said, he has a long and storied history in the DC Universe, and even if he doesn't return to his own title someday, I'm sure we're going to be seeing him pop up in other titles throughout the DC Universe going forward. The story itself was a good ending to Soule's narrative about Swamp Thing. I feel like he left a lot of doors open for continued stories. If another writer wanted to come in and pick up some of the threads that he left, or perhaps, like I said, if he himself returns to the character someday, I certainly would be happy to see Charles continue to explore some of the ideas that he was able to put forth in this book. The next book I'm going to mention is also an ending of sorts, and that's Green Lantern number 40, written by Robert Venditti, pencils by Billy Tan. The inks were by Mark Irwin, and the colors were by Tony Avina. As I mentioned, this book an end also. It's the end of Hal Jordan as the leader of the Green Lantern Corps, and perhaps you could even argue that it's the end of Hal Jordan as a Green Lantern, because by the end of this book, he no longer even has a ring, although he still has the power of the Green Lantern. So way back in the day with the Emerald Twilight storyline, Ron Marz was given the task of sending Green Lantern in a new direction, and I feel like some of the things he did weren't necessarily in character with who Hal Jordan is. What Venditti and company have managed to do here is split Hal Jordan off from the Green Lantern Corps while allowing the character to remain true to himself. Although not everybody knows it, it's perhaps one of the most heroic things Hal Jordan has ever done. So perhaps for the first time since Jeff Johns picked up the reins of Green Lantern way back when, we're going to see the book focus on Hal Jordan as a solo character. I look forward to seeing what new characterization and new challenges Venditti can bring to the book. And with the way this story ended, it's no surprise that a lot of the Green Lantern family of books have been canceled going forward. It's certainly going to be hard to wait 2 months to see what happens next. The next book I'm going to mention is Guardians of the Galaxy Team Up number 1 from Marvel. This book was written by Brian Michael Bendis. The art was handled by Art Adams, and the colors were by Paul Mounts. One thing I'll say real quick about the art, it wasn't quite as clean or as finished or as polished as I'm used to seeing from Art Adams. It still was a beautiful book to look at. It just wasn't quite up to Art Adams' usual standards. As far as the story goes, if you're a fan of the Guardians of the Galaxy movie or the other Guardians of the Galaxy comics, I'm sure you would find this a very enjoyable read. The story starts out with the Guardians returning to Earth. They're being pursued by some aliens. They kind of have an embarrassing crash landing, and then the Avengers show up. The Guardians and the Avengers team up. There's a huge battle with these other aliens, and we're left with somewhat of a cliffhanger ending. And that being said, even though it's a cliffhanger ending, there really wasn't enough of the story there. It wasn't compelling enough for me that I'll keep reading going forward. But then again, I'm not the biggest fan of the Guardians of the Galaxy. So it was an enjoyable read. It was not much to it, kind of lighthearted and fun, much like the Guardians of the Galaxy movie. So if you find yourself to be a fan of the movies or the other Guardians comics, this will probably be right up your alley. The next book I'm going to mention is also #1 from Marvel, and that's All New Hawkeye #1. This book has Jeff Lemire and Ramon Perez listed as storytellers, and Ramon Perez and Ian Herring listed as color artists. So what was very interesting in this book was there was several flashback sequences that were beautifully rendered and beautifully colored by the art team, and then there was the current storyline where the art was much more cartoony, much less polished, and it was very jarring for me visually. I felt like neither story really progressed that much. Perhaps if the issue had focused on one or the other, we may have got more of a narrative and understood really where the issue was going. That being said, Lemire's a great writer. I'll probably stick around for another issue or two to see where it goes from here. As I said, I felt the flashback sequences were beautifully done, and I just wish that Perez had brought a little more of that polish and a little more of that finished feel to the art that was based in present day. Just to give you a little bit of idea of the story, Hawkeye has continued his partnership or mentoring of the Kate Bishop Hawkeye character, and they've attacked a Hydra base to find some secret weapon that Hydra apparently is developing, and that's pretty much the whole issue. That's all we got. There's the typical banter back and forth between the Clint Barton Hawkeye and the Kate Bishop Hawkeye, which is certainly enjoyable. I love the dynamic between those two characters. So we'll have to see where the story goes from here. The next book I'm going to mention was also written by Jeff Lemire, and that's Descender #1 from Image Comics. The art in this issue was handled by Dustin Nguyen, and let me say right off the bat that I'm normally not a fan of Dustin Nguyen, but for this book his art was perfectly suited. The first half of the book, the art is very bright and clean, very tight lines, much more cleaned up and polished than I normally would expect to see in a Dustin Nguyen illustrated book. And the second half of the book, the art is much more the style that I'm used to. The colors are much softer, a little darker. The art isn't quite as clean, but it actually suits the story extremely well, because we see in the first half of the book that there is a federation of 9 planets. I'm not really sure if they're all in the same solar system or if they're just in close proximity to each other, but we see early on that each of these planets is visited by a giant robot, and before the inhabitants of those worlds can communicate with those robots or try to figure out what they're doing there, the robots attack and they harvest some of the humans. And then the story jumps forward 10 years and we learn that in the ensuing time, humanity has kind of had a backlash against machines and robotics and kind of wiped them out. So there's a lot of typical sci-fi tropes in there, a lot of ideas that aren't necessarily original. We also meet a small boy robot named Tim, and we learn that there's some connection between Tim's programming or the origin of Tim that has to do with these giant robots. And so they're actually bringing in the designer of this Tim small boy companion robot to try to understand what the connection might be between Tim and these other giant robots. So as I said, there are ideas that we've seen before in other sci-fi stories, but we've never seen them quite done this way, all mixed together. And I almost get a little bit of a Pinocchio vibe from the little Tim robot, and perhaps he wishes to be human. I'm not even sure how much he realizes that he is a robot. So as I said, a lot of ideas that we've seen in other stories before, but Lemire is managing to put a new spin on them and bring these ideas together, and it made for a very enjoyable first issue, and I plan on seeing where the story goes from here. Now, when I do these quick hits episodes, I usually pick one comic to be my book of the week, but this week I just couldn't decide between two, so at the end of the day I had to go with co-books of the week. The first one is The Big Con Job from Boom Studios. That book is written by Jimmy Palmiotti and Matt Brady. The art is handled by Domo Stanton, and the colors are by Paul Little. I've really been anticipating this book for a while now, looking forward to reading it, and to be honest, it wasn't quite as humorous as I expected it to be. It had much more of a serious, somber tone to it, and I didn't mind at all. It was a very interesting read. Extremely good characterization, both by the writers and the artists. I feel like Domo Stanton did an incredible job with the facial expressions and the postures and just the way he had the characters hold themselves that really helped with the characterization that Jimmy and Matt were bringing to these characters. You certainly were able to empathize with the characters very much, and I feel like this is a very relevant story. Just to give you a quick synopsis, the story is about some B-list celebrities, some celebrities who used to be real big back in the day, and they actually work the con circuit now. They go to these pop culture and comic book and sci-fi conventions. They sign autographs, they meet fans, they sell 8x10 pictures, and they see that their stars are starting to fade. They're not quite able to command the same dollars that they were and have the same amount of success at these conventions that they used to. And I feel like it's extremely relevant because in this day and age of constant news and social media, it seems like it's never been easier to have your 15 minutes of fame and to become a celebrity, but at the same time, it's probably never been easier to lose it all. So I certainly feel like when these people were on top, they weren't planning for the future. They thought that the gravy train would never run out, and it seems like that train has run out, and now they're faced with the reality of their situation when an opportunity comes along to perhaps pull off a huge heist and be set for life. So I'm a sucker for heist stories. That's why I was anticipating this book so much to begin with. And as I said, Palmiotti and Brady and Domo Stanton have done such a great job of breathing life into these characters. They feel real, they feel relevant. It's a story that longtime comic readers like myself, who've been reading comics for over 20 years, can certainly relate to. You know, if you've been going to conventions, you see the people that you kind of feel like, wow, I didn't even know that guy was still around. They're hanging around on the fringes. You know, you feel kind of bad for them. And at the same time, newer readers that see that comics have become such a mainstay and such a pillar of pop culture can understand because they've grown up in this environment of instant celebrity and social media. So I feel like they can relate as well. As I said, the story seemed a little more serious than I expected, but I was pleasantly surprised by how real the characters felt, and it was just a great, great book. Another great job by Palmiotti. I think this is Matt Brady's first time around the block as a writer. He certainly can't learn from anybody better than Jimmy Palmiotti. And the story, although not exactly what I was expecting, was actually even better than I hoped, and I can't wait to get my hands on issue 2. Now, the other book that made it impossible to choose between is Grayson by DC Comics. Issue number 8 was written by Tom King and Tim Seeley. The art was handled by Mikhail Janin, and the colors were by Jeremy Cox. Now for me, this is the single best title that DC Comics is putting out. This 8th issue kind of wraps up the first story arc that's been going on in Grayson, and for those of you not familiar with the premise of the story, in the Forever Evil storyline, Dick Grayson had been presumed dead, his identity as Nightwing had been revealed to the world, and since everyone believes him to be dead, Batman has decided to take advantage of that situation and have Dick Grayson infiltrate this secret spy organization known as Spiral. So being that it's a book about spies, you're never quite sure what to believe, what's real and what's not. It's very much a political book. There's a lot of spycraft, non-stop action, but Tim and Tom managed to inject a lot of humor, and Mikhail Janin, for me, is the single best artist working in comics today. I could look at his art all day long. So what was so great about this issue is the plot twist that Tom King and Tim Seeley put in. I didn't see coming. It seems like there's going to be a little bit of change in the status quo of Grayson going forward. The book was still packed with action and the humor that's become the trademark of the Grayson books so far. And as I said, Mikhail Janin's art is just outstanding. Super clean lines, amazing layouts, a very kinetic storytelling style from panel to panel, and it's just extremely smart storytelling both from the writers and the artists. And I also would be remiss if I didn't praise Jeremy Cox for his wonderful colors. What he does a great job of is bringing really bright, vibrant, bold colors to the action scenes, but then in the quieter scenes, the scenes filled with tension, more about the political side of the book, the tension that comes with Dick Grayson being a double agent in this organization. Cox does a great job of darkening the colors, darkening the mood, and bringing a somber feel to those scenes. As I said, Grayson is the best comic DC's putting out. Just some other books I want to mention real fast that came out today. Hulk 12 continues the Omega Hulk storyline by Jerry Dugan. The pencils were by Mark Bagley, inks by Drew Hennessy, and the colors were by Jason Keith. Now I mentioned a few episodes ago that I wasn't sure if Mark Bagley was the right artist for Hulk. I felt like maybe his style wasn't suited for the Hulk. Well, either I've gotten used to Mark Bagley on the Hulk, or he's changed his style up, but he really knocked it out of the park on this issue. The next book I'm going to mention is another Star Wars #1 from Marvel Comics. This was Princess Leia #1, written by Mark Waid, pencils by Terry Dodson, inks by Rachel Dodson, and awesome colors as usual by Jordi Belair. So I'm not a huge fan of Princess Leia. Just to let you know what the story's about, Alderaan has been destroyed, as we saw in the Star Wars New Hope movie, and she's taken upon herself to go around and rescue any citizens of Alderaan that managed to escape the destruction or who were off planet at the time. So just a way for Princess Leia to get a little bit of a spotlight. So if you're a big Princess Leia fan, it's probably going to be a story that you'll enjoy. The next book I want to mention real quick is Harley Quinn 15, written by Jimmy Palmiotti and Amanda Conner. Art by Chad Hardin, and he got a little bit of help from John Timms on this issue. Issue 15 was a little bit of a setup issue. We see that Harley feels like she has too much going on. She's spread herself too thin, so looks like she's going to take it upon herself to recruit other girls to help her out, kind of mini Harleys. So it looks like she's going to have a little gang of Harleys of her own going forward, and I'm sure there'll be lots of humor and hijinks to go along with that. I also want to mention Daemon #6 from Boom Studios. This book was getting a lot of attention about a year ago. It got optioned for a TV show or a movie, but I feel like it's lost some of its momentum just because it's had such an irregular schedule. It's written by Matt Gannon and Michael Allen Nelson. The art is by Brian Stillfreeze, and the colors are by Darren Moore. This series gets its title from the daemon that actually work for these various vampire families. They're kind of the facilitators, the warriors for these families. They can go out in daylight. They don't have those restrictions. So this is the story about one particular daemon and how he is trying to understand if he's actually part of the family that he works for or if he's just an employee. There's a lot of political intrigue going on. You know, these families, a lot of them have been at war or at each other's throats for thousands and thousands of years. So it's a pretty good story. If you're a fan of vampires, I definitely would give it a read. I would almost say it's like Blade, but just with a little more polish. It's certainly worth picking up. Like I said, this is issue 6, and I think the first 5 issues have been collected in trade, so it shouldn't be too hard to get your hands on those. And the final book I'm going to mention is Imperium #2 from Valiant Comics. This was written by Joshua Dysart with art by Doug Braithwaite and colors by Dave McQuaig. This continues the story of Toyo Harada, who, to quote a line from the book, is trying to bring peace to the world at the tip of the spear. This continues to be an extremely enjoyable read. Toyo Harada was kind of added to the world as this incredibly powerful psychic at the end of the Harbinger series by Valiant. That's also a great series. And this issue actually had a plot twist at the end that I in no way saw coming, and I can't wait to see where Joshua Dysart goes next. This issue, for me, in a nutshell, just proves why Joshua Dysart is one of the most underrated writers working in comics today. So I want to thank you all for joining me. Look for that long-awaited History of Harley Quinn episode to be up in the next day or two, and after that we'll see a spotlight episode on the small press publisher Hex Comics. I'll see you then.